Ah, crap. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what I accidentally like hit my keyboard and accidentally shut off the stream, and now we have to start all over again, or at least start the I'll just redo the intro, and then I'll do something at the of the stream to like combine this and the previous one. Now the playlist is gonna be all messed up because now there'll be like 10 parts to the reading of the Book of Mark, even though I only intended to be 8. But whatever. My bad there. I screwed up by accidentally hitting the keyboard with my fat fingers. But hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson reads the Gospel of Mark. Today we'll be reading from the New International Version. We'll be reading chapter 6, as last week we only read chapter 5, but that means it's going to be a shorter stream, but that's okay. Chapter 6 is pretty contentful, so I encourage you guys to follow along. And I will start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read through the Gospel of Mark, I pray that you would continue to reveal yourself to us and show us more of what it means to be a follower of you. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right, let's get started. All right, so actually, before we start reading, just do a quick review of chapter 5, because chapter 5 and 6 kind of go together. And so chapter 5 was about how as Jesus goes to different places, because so I guess I gotta give a bit of context for this. So Jesus' ministry starts in a place called Capernaum. In Catholic tradition, that's where Saint Peter or Pope Peter is from. Now that's his hometown. And Jesus started his base of operation in Capernaum. But at some point, and the Gospel of Mark kind of just assumes this and glosses over this, is like at some time later, as Jesus gained more popularity and notoriety, he started obviously going to other places outside of just Capernaum. So in chapter 5, he goes to the Gessarenes, which is, I don't know, someplace in Europe, in the southern part of Europe, just above like, you probably go there by boat to the Mediterranean. And so Jesus goes there, and then he also goes to, what place is this? It doesn't really say. He just says he goes somewhere across the lake. So he comes back from somewhere in Europe, and then he does the whole raising some guy named Jairus' daughter. So Jesus has kind of made his ministry more mobile, and he's going places. So that's kind of the context needed. So chapter 6 has more of this, and there's a discourse about how Jesus would spend more time outside of his home region, because there's the whole thing where, like, okay, Jesus is not even from Capernaum. He just starts his base of operation there, but he's actually from a place. Well, the funny thing is, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, we learn that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but he grows up in the countryside in a place called Nazareth. And then he doesn't even stay there. He goes to a different place called Capernaum. But Capernaum isn't like super far from Nazareth. But Jesus kind of doesn't go there. And chapter 6 begins the discourse of why Jesus' ministry is so mobile, if you will. Hey, Gauntlets, welcome to the stream. Yeah, sorry if the link thing is all messed up, though. because technically there are two streams of part 4. I'm going to edit the first part, and I'll probably call it something like not part 4, and then do a whole like right in the edit note that like I don't actually start reading in this post refer to actual part 4 or something like that. And the reason for that is because my fat fingered my keyboard. That's the real reason why. But anyway, chapter 6, let's begin. Chapter 6. So Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these teachings?" they asked. "What is this wisdom that has been given him? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us as well?" And the people took offense to Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own home." He could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. So Jesus went around teaching from village to village, calling the 12 to him. And Jesus began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. His instructions were, "Take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as testimony against them." They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. So King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying, "John the Baptist had been raised back from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Sorry, I was supposed to keep doing the voice there. "And that's why miraculous powers are at work in him." And other people said, "He is Elijah." And others still claim, "He is a prophet, like the prophets of long ago." But when Herod heard this, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead?" For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested and had him bound and put into prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. Or whom Herod had married. The syntax is not very good here. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she wasn't able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked listening to him. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give to you, up to half of my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" "The head of John the Baptist," she answered. At once the girl hurried in to the king with the request, "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guest, he did not want to refuse her. So he sent for an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went and beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a plate. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So Jesus began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already pretty late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered, You give them something to eat." Sorry, I should read that again. But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." The disciples responded, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go check." When they found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on green grass. And so they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven. Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces of fish and bread. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Verse 45. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountain to pray. So later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that the disciples straining the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they cried out because they were all terrified. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It's me. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. For they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran through that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, whether it was a village, a town, or the countryside, they placed the sick in marketplaces. They begged Jesus to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Oof, chapter 6 was a long one. Just going to take a quick drink here, and then we'll dive into the discourse. So, chapter 6 begins with Jesus actually returning to Nazareth, as I was foreshadowing earlier. And he basically starts teaching in the synagogue there. And in the book of Mark, we don't really hear what he actually talks about. The book of Matthew and Luke versions, they give us a lot more. I think it's like an Isaiah scroll he reads. And basically it's the whole, I've come to bring good news I come to bring good news to the poor and all that stuff. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me discourse. And so the people are like, who's this guy think he is, basically? Because before they do that, Jesus, after he reads that scroll, he makes the claim about like, today this prophecy has been filled among you. And then that's one of those moments. The book of Mark, we won't count it because it's not explicitly said here. But it's one of those moments where Jesus is basically saying that he is the Messiah. That's why the book of Matthew brings it up a lot more, because it's making that Messiah comparison, which is a very Jewish thought thing. But basically, Jesus is making that claim, and so the people are like, in his town, they're like, who's this guy think he is? In the Mark version, it mentions how, like, we know this guy. You know, Jesus grew up here. We've seen this kid grow up. We know who he is. We know his family. And so, how can this guy start making these claims about, like, being the Messiah and stuff like that? And so, Jesus, he makes a comment about how a prophet is respected everywhere except his hometown. So what's interesting about this, and the book of Mark will bring this up briefly, but the book of Matthew definitely brings it up again, where the reference that Jesus is making when he says a prophet is not respected in his hometown, he's making a reference to the book of Jonah. And there's an interesting thing in Jonah that Jesus makes a lot of parallels to, about a prophet going away from God, and then getting caught up in like the craziest things, and then like being essentially well, in the book of Jonah, it's more metaphorical about him being dead, but in Jesus' case, it's taken quite literally. But and then there's of course the whole like, Jonah makes the whole point about how the reason why. Okay, so I gotta give some context of the book of Jonah. So the book of Jonah is a story about a prophet named Jonah, and God tells him, go to this place called Nineveh. And then basically the TLDR is he tries to run away. God gets mad at him. He causes like a storm while he's at sea. There's a theme going on here. And so Jonah gets thrown off the ship, because Jonah tells the people of the ship that like, that's how you're gonna stop the storm. You gotta throw me off the ship. And the guys feel really bad about it, so they throw him off the ship, and then a big fish swallows him, and then he effectively is like, see, the Bible kind of implies that like he may actually have died there, because I don't think anyone can survive inside of a fish for like 3 whole ass days. So he probably died, and then like God revived him, because God can do that. So Jonah then ends up in Nineveh, and then he preaches a message of repentance, and then the city changes. They repent from their evil ways. And then the 4th chapter of Jonah is basically Jonah being all pissed off about it. The reason why he's so pissed off about it is because he knew what was going to happen. To backtrack a little bit, the reason why Jonah wanted to run away and go a different direction by boat when God told him go to Nineveh and preach to them was because Jonah was like, why would you want me to go to Nineveh? These people are like so awful. They're like the worst people on the face of this planet. I really don't want to deal with these people. That was basically Jonah's attitude, and God didn't like his attitude. So after the city repents, Jonah gets really pissed off at God, and he goes like, I knew this was gonna happen. I knew this was gonna happen. And then while Jonah's giving his whole complaint about like knowing the Ninevites were gonna change, he makes a comment about how, because everywhere you send me, people are led to repentance. Only in my own hometown does that not happen. And then that's the logic that's played here is that that's why Jonah's so pissed off. And that is a common thing that many of pastors do struggle with. This idea of, you know, you're not respected in your home context, but you can go elsewhere and, um, have a successful ministry. And the Jesus story plays it pretty well because, of course, there's the whole like part of that is because, well, imagine like you trying to talk to people you once knew and they knew who you were in the past. Of course, there's the whole thing where like, I've made this discourse so many times, but that's why cancel culture is like the antithesis of Christianity, because cancel culture will go to like something you said in the past that you may no longer believe and say like, oh, you're a racist or sexist or whatever because of something you said 10 years ago. It's like, well, I'm not that person. That would be the rational response would be, well, I'm not that person anymore. Because in Christianity, we believe people can change. And that's what you see a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of stories and powerful testimonies on even YouTube where people. There was a great oh crap, I forgot her name. She was an OnlyFans girl. Did like pornography basically. And recently she had converted to Christianity, and there was a whole thing about that. It was a big, the controversy behind that is like, see people on the internet would be like, oh, like she was the OnlyFans girl, she was this terrible person, but the Christian worldview is, well, that's the past, and if she, and this is assuming, because I don't know her personally, but this is assuming that her conversion is genuine, then the only thing I care about at that point is who are you now and how will you go forward? How will you continue? How will you live your life serving Christ now? That's the important question. Who you were in the past is not a big deal. But see, when it comes to coming back to the whole prophets not being respected in their hometown, I think a big reason for that is because people can't get rid of that past image. And that's why a concept like a born again virgin doesn't exist. So, going back to our OnlyFans friend here, that will like, sure, there will always be like, even with her conversion to Christianity and getting rid of her OnlyFans account and everything, one, the internet doesn't forget. Secondly, it's one of those things that's like, that's a tough thing to overlook, because even if you've changed your ways, your dating prospects are still kind of like in trouble, because that is part of you are a continuation of your past. And so there will always be that, like, people will always look at you and be like, well, you were once like this. That is still part of who you are, even if you've changed. And so there'll always be that kind of struggle, and that's definitely true in the pastoral world. I know a lot of pastors that have to deal with that. They were not good people in the past. But then of course, like, once again, in the Christian worldview, is forgiveness is important. Secondly, an honest person would acknowledge that, well, nobody's perfect. You don't, and this is where, like, once again, you get your non-Christians saying, well, they don't, you don't need Christianity to know that. Which, I mean, you're not wrong. But with that said, that's all the more reason we need grace. But that's where, ironically, it's all the more reason we need Jesus, is because we cannot generate that grace on our own. So work with my transient of logic here. Any honest human being will acknowledge that nobody's perfect. Therefore, we all need grace. But the problem is that the amount of grace to give to not just all people, but even to one person is not something that we can do on our own. We don't possess the power to generate that kind of grace on our own. And that's why we need the power of Jesus to do that, and the grace of Jesus, so that we can give grace to others. Because the reality is, yeah, you look at anyone's past, everybody's got stuff they've done. No matter how squeaky clean they look, everybody's got some stuff in their past they've done. And I mean, some things may not be as big a deal as others. You know, I think like, okay, a little, you know, a person who like threw some gamer slurs when they were teenagers is not the same thing as like OnlyFans girl. Okay, those two very different levels, right? Not all sin is equal. Before some idiot says that, and I don't even know why that people even thought that, but it doesn't matter if your sins are not as bad as others. We all still fallen short of the glory of God. And so it's easy for people to focus on those things. Oh, you weren't so perfect here. You weren't so great there. And so it's easy, and it's easy to get caught up on that and to have that be a barrier as to like why you won't, why prophets, or I guess in modern lingo, like preachers in their own hometowns, don't get respect. And the Bible kind of plays on this a little bit. And it's, you know, Jesus is paralleling himself with other prophets in the Old Testament. And of course, in the future, where us as modern Christians can relate to Jesus in that way. But the ironic bit, with that being said, the ironic bit is that, well, Jesus didn't have that tumultuous past. But despite that, people couldn't get past, like, oh, he was just the carpenter's kid. He's the sibling of these other people, which I'm pretty sure like Jude and the rest of them, you know, would have been like not so perfect people, you know, and stuff like that. It's hard to look past like what you know of someone if you've grown up with them, and that's fair. But at the same time, I mean, that's just the harsh reality of it, and it sucks too. You just gotta deal with it, I guess. There's no real way. There's no real way around it. But, yeah. So, with that said, that the ending of that little segment before Jesus sends out the 12, Jesus, after Jesus makes that statement about a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. Verse 5 then makes this statement about how Jesus wasn't able to do miracles, which is interesting, you know, because you would think that, like, well, Jesus is God. We establish in chapters 1 and 2 that, like, Jesus has the authority over nature. He can just do whatever he wants. You know, when there's a guy that says, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, yeah, I will be clean. Boom, done. But here in the beginning of chapter 6, there's this interesting bit where Jesus isn't able to perform miracles. And so I think what Mark is essentially getting at is how important faith is. Because of course, you know, in the earlier, I think it was chapter 4, when Jesus calms the storm, not to get confused with walking through the storm, two different stories. So when Jesus calms the storm and Jesus calls out his disciples, he's like, yo, like, why didn't you have faith? The same thing is kind of being played out here, where the people in his hometown, they don't have faith. And so Jesus is like, well, means I can't do anything for you. Which is interesting because, once again, there's that, as Chris mentioned, in the book of John, there's that whole, like, a lot more emphasis on Jesus' divinity. it's easy to get caught up that like people forget that Jesus is God because he also acts very human at times. So like in this is a case in point in chapter 6 of Mark where Jesus acts very human. If his Jesus' logic is probably something along the lines of, well, if you're not gonna believe the stuff I say, then it don't matter a damn thing what I do, so I'm not gonna do it. And so that, I mean, fair enough. That's what anyone would probably think. So it's not any surprise that if Jesus thought that, I would not be remotely surprised. And that's probably why, as we read here in chapter 6, that Jesus didn't perform miracles after the disbelief. Because Jesus would be like, well, there'd be no point to it. That's how I kind of think of that. I know that some people might, and I mean, I could be wrong, and I'm sure people disagree with that, but from what I read here in Scripture, that's kind of what I gather. Is that if like Jesus didn't see a point to doing miracles, if the people weren't gonna believe anyway, there'd be no point to it. So why bother? Whereas in even like the leper case in chapter 1, it's like this guy believes, that's enough reason. But if people aren't gonna believe in his hometown, then Jesus wouldn't bother. And I mean, to be fair, like think of you'd probably think the same thing when it comes to like your work or little bit of couples advice, I guess. Something that, especially to the ladies out there, a little bit of advice to you ladies. Uh, don't tell your man what to do, even if he's already gonna do it, because the moment you give that whole like I'm telling you to do this, the man's brain immediately shifts to, well, now I don't want to do it because you said it. And so uh, it's kind of like that, you know, that there's that negativity. People are, if people experience that negativity, then they become unmotivated. And when Jesus doesn't perform miracles in Nazareth, it makes you could make that claim being true, that like, oh, Jesus became unmotivated to help people because, well, there's the whole no point, there's no reason to it, as I already mentioned. And of course, if people are gonna if people are gonna reward his goodness with bitterness, then you wouldn't want to do it. It makes you not want to do it. And so there's an interesting point there in chapter 6, and I think in little passing moments like this, the Gospel of Mark really shows that even though Jesus is the Son of God, he also is very human in a lot of these stories. He's very human. The idea of like the Son of God is not just like some foreign idea. Not as opposed to like, if you remember when I was talking about like the whole Son of Man thing. And the reason why the Son of Man is easily seen as a divine title is because the Son of Man is associated with the more alien parts of God, the whole Ancient of Days thing. And so, but in the book of Mark, we see that Jesus is very human. And I think that's where like as Chris was asking earlier, maybe there is some possibility that some people may have misinterpreted parts of Mark like that and overly playing on his human side. But of course, once again, it's like a weird pendulum. People can never be sure. Like people can never stay in the camp of like be. Let me put it this way: people cannot seem to just stay in the middle. When we talk about Jesus, we're either swinging to his more human side or his spirit side, but we never stay in just the middle. Just like politics, it's we can't just stay in one place when it comes when we're studying the Gospels or anything like that. That's just human psychology in a nutshell, though. It's less about the Bible and more about human thinking. I'm going to skip this whole, well, not skip it, but it's going to be pretty brief when we talk about when Jesus sends the 12 out. So basically, we do know that Jesus doesn't just do everything himself. in his ministry, he has his one reason why he has the 12 disciples is so that they can get some experience on going out and preaching the message of repentance. Because of course, Jesus already probably had in mind. And it's easy for us to look at this like retrospectively, but most of these guys, not all of them, they're gonna be preaching the gospel message. And so Jesus wants to get a little bit of experience beforehand. So he's like, okay, go to these places, tell about give them the message of repentance and stuff like that. And then there's the whole like, try not to pack too heavy. Try and see if you can find hospitable people and people who are receptive of the message. And I think that is the whole like, when Jesus commands the disciples, like, if you stay at someone's house, stay there the whole time until like you leave that town. It's less to do about like, oh yeah, don't pay for expensive hotels, but it has more to do with find the people who are receptive to the message that you're giving. Find those people. And build camaraderie, build friendships with them. It's more to do with that. And that's why Jesus tells them, like, don't pack extra stuff. Find people to stay with. Build friendships. Build connection with people. Moving on to verse 14. Okay, so verse 14 to 29 is a pretty long segment. And we're probably going to spend the bulk of the next good 30 minutes, I should say, talking about just this one thing. So I already talked about this a little bit in the first reading week of this series. And we're back to John the Baptist. So the story begins with, we start in the present day of the story anyway, where Jesus has started gaining a lot more popularity, and people are talking about, like, who is this Jesus guy? And of course, they associate with like prophets and stuff. And I have to explain a little bit of like Jewish mythology, because it's going to be relevant for not just this story with John the Baptist, but a later part in chapter 6. So a little bit of Jewish mythology. Well, the later part of chapter 6, not so much, but a little bit of Jewish mythology. So this whole resurrection discourse, the crux of Christianity, is not a new thing. It has actually been a thing in Judaism for basically ever. Okay, not the entirety of Judaism, but the bulk of Judaism had a belief in the resurrection. And so there, not so much of the resurrection itself, but more like what the afterlife was to be like. And popular theory is because, going back to the Pentateuch, the Israelites, when God instructed the Israelites to be different from other cultures like the Egyptians and the Canaanites, the Israelites probably interpreted this as well to change how they viewed mythology. And so in most mythologies, there's the way that we understand the afterlife. And so in most cases, the afterlife is like this spiritual dimension. So if you remember my layers of existence, the tiers of existence. So you have what we call the vulgar, which is like the material world. Then you have the spirit world. And then you have something called the celestial world, where heaven exists. And so the spirit world, the middle part, this is where people go when they die. And so traditionally, so you take like Hinduism as a good example of how they understand this. So in Hinduism, most forms of Hinduism, it doesn't make sense, and this is probably why the spirit world exists in most people's religion and mythology, is because it doesn't make sense for the vulgar to access the celestial world. There's no reason why the gods can just chill out with, sorry, the humans can just chill out with the gods when they die. That doesn't make logical sense. So a layer was added in between them, and I remember when I was explaining the whole like how Christianity has like similarities to a lot of Asian religions. It's because of this thinking. So the the spirit world is where people go where they die, and most mythologies believe this. Most, or not believe this, weird way of wording it. Most mythologies have this idea. So obviously in Egyptian mythology, where the Israelites have been slaves for 400 years, they obviously had this belief, and that's the whole like the scales of good and uh, just and unjust living in Egyptian spirituality. And if you're judged properly, then you get to enter the afterlife, and that's in the spirit realm. You don't get to hang out with the gods. The gods hang out somewhere else. And so most religions had the spirit realm aspect. And so not to say, okay, sorry, I almost jumped ahead. So perhaps being aware of how most other religions operated with this paradigm, Judaism wanted to not imitate that. So instead of saying there was vulgar, spirit, celestial, it was basically vulgar and then new vulgar and then celestial. There was no in between. And so the how would you have the vulgar and the new vulgar? So the vulgar, where we all live, you live your life there, and then you try and be a good enough person, whatever, to appease God, and then but then eventually, okay, let me sorry, I'm jumping forward again. So and then you die, trying to do your best before God. Then eventually there'll come a point where the vulgar is going to fade, and then we're gonna have a new vulgar, because God is going to make a new world. And this is where Revelation also comes in. Revelation uses some of these ideas and then incorporates other elements. And of course, a big part of Revelation, which is a major part of Christian discourse, is that it's not vulgar and new vulgar, it's the vulgar, and then God comes down, he merges the celestial and the vulgar to the new heaven and the new earth. And that's where Revelation has it. But anyway, back to Jewish mythology. So it was vulgar and then new vulgar. And the new vulgar would still exist in the vulgar world, but the way humans experience it would become different. And that's why it's called the new vulgar. And so when people are reintroduced into the vulgar, because they've already experienced the vulgar, they get to become the next level of the vulgar. And so the Jewish mythology had a kind of, when you say it out loud, it sounds really funny. But basically, they believe that when you come back into the world again in your new life, you also get to exist above it. You get to be, because it's not quite the whole spirit realm thing where you get to be a higher being, but you're a higher being like in the spirit realm, but you also still exist in the vulgar. So in Jewish mythology, they came up with the idea that like you get superpowers basically. And so what the resurrection would entail is that you come back to life, because that's your first new superpower, is that you're able to come back from the dead. And then you can do all kinds of stuff that you couldn't do, because once again, when we're in the normal life, we have our limited bodies. But now you get a new superpower body that can do super stuff that you couldn't do in your old life. And so this is where people believed. This is where ancient Israelites kind of believed how people gained powers to do miracles, because it's before some like postmodernist says, well, that's just like superstitious thinking of things we can now explain through science. But for the most part, people always thought in the ancient world that miracles were from the supernatural. But humans can't do that on their own. But when they get the new resurrected body, they would be given or achieve those powers or whatever. And so, why am I going to this whole Jewish mythology discourse? Well, that's because that's what people were thinking of Jesus when he was doing miracles. And that's why you read these passages about how when Jesus, in the book of Matthew, Jesus has the whole, like, who do people think I am? And then here you have Herod and his guys, and they're all thinking, like, who is this Jesus guy? Is he John the Baptist raised from the dead? Is he Elijah? Or is he one of the prophets of old? And so the idea that's kind of crept into these guys' minds comes from this Jewish mythology mindset. That if these guys could have been like ancient people, like these ancient prophets, resurrected, and through that resurrection were given magic powers. That's basically what they thought. Because that was how Judaism understood the afterlife. Because once again, part of it was the whole Judaism wanted to be different from other cultures, so the afterlife isn't the same as how most other mythologies viewed the afterlife. But with that said, there's another element to the afterlife thing, which is why people would be freaked out if quote unquote people were resurrected and then gained magic powers. So, of course, among all mythologies and belief systems, you obviously have to divide good people and bad people when they die. So, most of the time, bad people go to the bad place. So, in most religions and mythologies, Egyptian, Greek, etc., you basically go to the equivalent of hell. Whether it's Tartarus or I don't remember what the other ones are called. I was gonna say the Egyptian one, and it just slipped my mind. But basically, you go to like Tartarus in Jewish mythology is a place called Sheol, the place of absolute darkness. If you are a bad person, you go to the bad place. And then in most mythology, if you're a good person, you go to a good place. So, the field of Elysium in Greek mythology, it's the place where good people go when they die. But as I was just explaining earlier, in Jewish mythology, they didn't want to have that spirit realm extra place. So instead of bad place, so this isn't good place, bad place. It's the good place in Jewish mythology would have been you return to the real world, but you get to be above the real world, because then you can't be subject to the decays of, well, normal life. And that's where the magic powers come in. And so if someone did rise from the dead, so you have to think of it from the logic of like a first century Jew now. If a person actually came back from the dead and gained these magic powers, it means they were good people, because they go to the good place when they die. So this is why when we read Herod's reaction, he's like, oh shit. he's thinking like, oh shit, if this is John the Baptist raised from the dead, I'm beyond boned. And then the Bible goes into backstory why Herod would think this. And we read the story about how Herod unjustly, really unjustly, has John the Baptist killed. So as I mentioned in the first chapter reading, John the Baptist is an interesting character because the Bible doesn't delve much into this, and the Bible didn't feel the need to, I guess. The Bible gives us a little bit more context to it here in chapter 6, But the TLDR is that John the Baptist was very political in his religious views, I guess you could say. He was very political. And he calls out Herod and his sister-in-law slash wife. Yeah, that's a thing. So John's basically saying like, you can't, that this is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. Just remember, uh, it's essentially adultery that Herod is banging his brother's wife basically. So John the Baptist is like, this is no good, this is bad, don't do that. And so the Bible tells us that Herodias, um, the brother's wife, she took that very, very personally. And the Bible even mentions she built a massive grudge. Like she must have hated him. But the Bible shows this interesting bit where like Herod didn't want to treat John badly. Like he had to imprison him to appease, his woman. But he also didn't want to like just kill John just because. Because I mean, to be fair, that's how you have tyrannical governments. If 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 politicians were just killing people who talked a little bit of shit about them, well, for starters, we wouldn't have any no one would ever be a comedian anymore for starters. Um, but basically, like Harry didn't want to like make himself a political villain that way. He didn't want to just kill someone just because he was talking shit about his politicians at the time. And so Herod was keeping John in prison. But of course, we read in the story that Herodias came up with this plan to have John killed. And so on Herod's birthday, she has her daughter dance for him and in front of an audience. And so Herod, he stupidly makes an oath. And there's always a lot of funny parallels with like other parts in the Bible where people just make dumbass oaths, which is probably why in the book of Matthew, Jesus tells people do not make oaths. It just makes you look really, really stupid. Especially if you get caught up in a dilemma like this one, where Herod makes an oath to his... See, it's kind of funny. What do we call her? His niece slash daughter. Well, she's not really his daughter. She's his niece, but he's also banging her mom. So, it's kind of weird like that. Before someone says it, yes, it does appear very, like... Never mind. Hashtag terrible pastor. But, basically, Herodias, through her daughter, orders for John to be beheaded. So, which is pretty awful. And so, going back to the beginning of that story, why Herod would be so freaked out if this Jesus guy was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Because it basically means that like, oh, all those things I did, it truly does show I'm a bad, bad person. Like, it's not just some guy being political telling me I'm a bad person. It's, oh, no, this is like living proof I am a horrible person. That's basically what that would mean. If that were true. Of course, we, the audience, know that that's not true. Jesus is his own person and John isn't Jesus. So, Herod's concern is a little bit blown out of proportion, but I mean, that's the whole superstitious mindset of ancient people. It's just kind of how it is, and us as modern people can easily like mock the ancient world because of that. But that's how people thought back then, and that's just kind of how it was. So Herod thought that like, oh, the day of reckoning has come. And I'm judged as a bad person because I killed a good man. So that's why when you read stuff like this in the Gospels about how when people, they question Jesus' ability to do, they question Jesus' ability to do miracles. And, sorry, I'm burping because of the tea. They question Jesus' ability to do miracles and associate him with prophets of the past. That's why. Uh, See, it took me half to almost like 25 minutes to explain that, but that's why. Uh, Next, we have the feeding of 5,000, or sorry, the feeding. See, the Bible the when you read in the Bible and then like they divide up sections of chapter 6, because chapter 6 is pretty long. They call this part feeding the 5,000, but it's actually kind of erroneous, and I'm going to explain why it's kind of erroneous. But before I do that, let's just read a bit of the common things you hear about this story in Sunday school, as well as like on your regular Sunday church service. So when Jesus feeds the multitude of people, that's what I refer to it as, because we don't actually know how many people there were. We can make an estimate, but you'll hear that later. So Jesus goes around, he's teaching, and when Jesus wants to spend some alone time with his disciples, people hear about his whereabouts. And this just reminds you like how much notoriety and popularity Jesus has acquired for let's say a year, maybe 2 years. We're not totally sure. We just know we're not in the third year of his ministry yet, because he's not like, you get a lot more of the Jerusalem stuff during that. But basically, Jesus during his ministry, he's gained a lot of popularity. So basically, he's at the point where whenever people hear he's at a place, they want to be there. They want to hear the stuff he says. They definitely want the miracles and the superpower stuff, because powers are cool. So the people definitely want to see that, and they definitely want to hear what he has to say. But then, of course, it starts running late, and the disciples are like, "Yo, Jesus, just send these people away. Make them like, have them go home. It's getting late. It's getting dark." But Jesus tells them, "Oh, sorry." The disciples are like, "Send them home so they can get something to eat, because it's been a long day and people are probably hungry." And then Jesus does something interesting. He tells the disciples, "Well, you feed them." And the disciples are probably thinking, "With what?" And that's where you get like these little funny bits of text where Mark includes this detail about how the disciples are like, "Well, if we were going to do that, it would take us like half a year's pay. None of us have that kind of money." And then Jesus asks them, "Well, what do you have?" And then they're like, "Well, we don't have much. We got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, which might feed like one family. Maybe." uh, yeah, it's like one family, maybe. Because you assume that, well, if there's 5 loaves, it's for a family of 5, and then the 5 people split 2 fish. It's not that much food. That's basically the point. And so they're like, "It's not much." And then Jesus tells them, just have them sit. Have them, be ready as if they're going to eat. Which I'm pretty sure the disciples were thinking, no freaking way. Like, how's it going to work? Like, this 5 loaf, 2 fish can barely feed one family. How the hell are we going to feed all these people? But what's interesting, well, the thing about most of these miracles where Jesus, I call them the food-related miracles. So there's this one. There's another time he does it with like 7 loaves of bread and some fish or something like that. He does his miracle twice. And then there's also the water into wine story in John. And in most of these stories, oh, I guess you can apply this to like the fishing stories, because it's still food. They were fishing to eat them, so it counts. So anyway, the whole point of these something that's a common theme in these miracles, and the whole point of these miracles, really. And I want to contrast this to the beginning of chapter 6, where Jesus doesn't perform miracles in Nazareth, because the people don't believe. They don't believe in him anyway. So, in all these food related miracles, Jesus will ask the people, in this case his disciples, and the water to wine one, it's like a bunch of servants at the wedding, but besides the point. Jesus tells the people to do something that would go against their nature. And that's the thing that, like, it's always the fundamental arm wrestle of Christianity, and why people resist to believe. And on the one hand, it's like, okay, yeah, like I get it. Christianity is not something simple to believe, and a big reason for that is because a lot of the time Jesus will ask of us to do things that go against our thinking, and that's always the big struggle. So in this story's case, and I'll give like a real life example as well, but in this story's case, so Jesus is telling these disciples, we're going to feed these people with what little we have. And the disciples are thinking, no freaking way this is going to work. How the hell are you going to feed this many people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? You can't even feed one family with that, let alone, I don't know, a few thousand families. So Jesus says, just do this. Just do this thing. Even when it goes against your thinking. And so the disciples are like, all right, we're going to trust Jesus and do this thing even though it seems completely ridiculous and nonsensical. And so Jesus tells them, start serving. Don't worry about what I'm doing here. God be doing his thing. You do what you're supposed to be doing. And so the disciples just serve, and they keep serving. And it's one of those things where, like, you wonder if, like, the disciples start thinking, what the hell? This is not making any sense. How did I have more than what I started with? Because remember, the Bible mentions that, like, they divided the people into, like, groups of 50s or, like, groups of even 100 people. So, like, in order to bring a platter to 100 people, that's got to be a big-ass platter. Probably, like, a basket, probably, full of stuff to a group of 100 people. Because once again, if you were to try and do the whole 5 bread 2 fish thing and ratio it to 100 people, that means you would need 100 loaves of bread, because the idea is that everybody eats 1 loaf, and, like, trying to do some mental math here, like 40 fish. You brought 40 fish and 100 pieces of bread, and the son was probably wondering, how the hell did I have way more than what I started with? Which would be a legitimate question. But as far as the Christian life is concerned, I think that's how we tend to forget when it comes to serving Jesus in our lives. I think we tend to forget that, like, we get too focused on how things are going to get done. And, you know, I'm guilty of this too. Anybody who says they haven't been guilty of this, question them. But everybody's been guilty of this. Every believer's been guilty of this. I mean, God has you, you know, follow his command. And the first step of faith is doing, like, okay, like, this is not something I would do, but because I trust you, I'm going to do it. And then as you start doing the work for the Lord, it's probably crossed your mind. You're like, how the hell did I end up with this? Because it doesn't make sense that I have this. And it's easy to see that the disciples might have thought that. And that's something that, you know, just a reminder in your own life as you follow the Lord. And you're going to have those moments. You're going to have moments where, like, this doesn't make sense. Whether it's because God is telling you to do something ridiculous, and that doesn't make sense in of itself. Or as you're going through the motions, stuff in it just doesn't make sense. Because it's so much more than what you and I can comprehend. Because, you know, even within this story, Jesus is just doing his thing. He's somehow multiplying the bread and the fish. The disciples don't stop him and go, "How are you doing that?" They just continue to serve the people. And that's what the Christian life is about. Is God does his thing and we do our thing. And our thing may not be that impressive in comparison. I mean, they're just serving the food. They're not making the food, but stuff is happening. The people are being fed in the story. And in our own lives, people are being spiritually fed. As we faithfully live the word of Christ. And so that's the application, I guess, and as we read through this story. Oh yeah, the real life example I was going to use. So a real life example, not in my own life, but just a thing that I've observed, and now we're seeing it play out in real time. Streaming Parson hot takes of the week. I haven't had one all week, so we gotta do one now. So, wow, it's one of those funny things as I play Unicorn Overlord. If you haven't been watching that playthrough, you should definitely do it. Uh, we'll be back on Monday with it. But anyway, even as I've been playing through that game, I realized I didn't have very many hot takes. Okay, I know the hot take I do have is that Sharon is probably one of the best girls in that game. I know a lot of people would pick other girls over her, but I really like her. But anyway, the real topic at hand, hot takes. I'm surprised I haven't had a lot of hot takes in that game. That's why I brought it up. But here's your hot take of the week. So, you probably hear it nowadays. The practical wisdom thing is for couples to live together before they're married. When you're dating someone, you move in together. And there's a huge appeal to that because in reality, you can't deny that it has practical applications to it. The big one being that you learn a lot more about the other person. You learn a lot more about anyone when you live with them. So, let's say if you're dating someone, you really want to know what they're like as a person. Living with them would be the fast track to doing that. You learn way more about a person by living with them. Even if you there's a difference between even if you saw each other every day, living with them is a whole different thing. You just imagine in high school, you see people every single day, but you really don't know that well, one, because you're busy with school, but you also don't you're not close enough, if you will, in the school setting to really know someone and what they're like. But if you live with someone, you can learn things so fast. You could living living with someone for a month, you learn way more about that person than if you saw them every single day at school for a year. Living with someone for a month, you would learn way more. And so that's one of the major practical reasons why okay, young couples, you should being told that they should move in together and live together. But in the Christian worldview, they say, well, that's not a good idea. People that are dating should not live together. Oh, sorry. We got running water noise. Just gonna mute the mic for a sec. Water noise is off. And I had to change the description to the other part 4. Not part 3, but not yet 4. Anyway, back to the whole feeding the multitude story. So now we see in real time that, like, okay, it's actually not the best for like couples to live together before they're married. And once again, there's a lot of reasons people would say it's a good idea. I mentioned before, you can get to know someone a lot better. Money is another one, because especially in this day and age, uh, moving out of your parents' place is not easy. So some couples, they'll do it to, one, move out of their parents' place, and then their combined income can make that feasible. So you have stuff like that. But then, of course, we were seeing in real time now that actually this is not the most practical thing. So there are things that people just don't anticipate. Just because you're dating, I mean, to be fair, some people might make the argument that, like, just because you're married doesn't mean your relationship is quote unquote secured. But in dating, it's way more volatile. Whereas, like, marriage is going to be like pretty extreme to force a separation or a divorce. Unless, well, usually it has to be pretty extreme for a case of a marriage. And before someone goes like, well, like, think of all those like TikTok relationships. Those are not the litmus you ever use if you ever want to make a counterpoint. But for the most part, most marriages, they tend to hold better. And when people wait till they're married before they live together, they tend to do better. They tend to one, their marriages last longer. The relationship's not as volatile, and that's because, well, there's a bunch of reasons for it, but one reason is because when when people live together earlier before they're married, they're they're quick to be more critical. So when I was pointing out the upside of a couple living together before they're married, and then you start learning a lot about who they really are. When a person gets married, they they kind of like install into their brain the idea of, like, okay, I made a commitment, I'm going to live with this person for the rest of my life, at least try my best anyway. So with that said, I'm going to make sure I don't do anything too damn stupid. So people install in their brains, think of it like a program. You install in your brain the program of, even when I learn things that are not the best about my spouse, I'm not going to be critical about it. I'm not going to be overly critical. But when, let's say, a younger couple, they're living together, they're dating and they start living together, that that hasn't been installed in them. And so they can be way more critical if they notice certain flaws in their partners. And actually, research shows that that is actually why a lot of young couples, when they start living together early, the relationship actually breaks down a lot faster. It's actually because of that. It's because they become way more critical. So let's say, uh, okay, the quintessential example is when women get frustrated with their man because he doesn't put the toilet seat back down after he pees, because, as guys, we lift the seat. So the woman gets really, she gets annoyed by the fact that he doesn't put the seat back down. It, if a couple is living together before they're married, a lot of the time, that's one of the first things that comes up. The woman is very critical about that. Like, why is this prick I'm living with so inconsiderate? That's usually what goes on in her head. And of course, when guys got deal, and oh my gosh, dealing with this was a hassle. women do something called goo hoarding. So for those of you fellows who don't know what that is, goo hoarding is when you know, women like their all their hair products and their makeup removal products and other facial products, and it's just lined up all over the bathroom counter, and you can't find your freaking toothbrush and all that. That's what that is. Women have like they have all their care products and stuff like that, and a lot of women are pretty unorganized about it. Ladies, don't lie. You know you're unorganized about it. But see, when you're married, you just assume that like, okay, I'm not gonna be critical about this. I married this person because I love them for who they are, and I'm not gonna be critical about it. But younger couples who uh, they move in together, the men are very critical of that. It's always bathroom things too. I figure when I was doing the research for it, it's always bathroom things. But like couples are couples that aren't married, they're super quick to be critical about it, and that's actually why a lot of relationships dissolve if they start living together early. Which is funny that that is actually the bigger factor and not the whole like um, see the reason why it's important to point that out is because before someone says it, uh, I am not arguing against living together early because of religious reasons. Because I know the religious reason would be that, well, couples shouldn't be living together because of like sex before marriage discourse. That's actually like usually that when couples are living together, they've already done that, so you don't think about it that way. Um, like that's not that shouldn't be in your peripheral at that point, because if a couple moves in together, they've already done that. So not a useful talking point, which is why you know Christians are wrong when they talk about it that way. But the real reason why relationships break down is because people are far more critical when they start picking up on the person's actual habits. Anyway, what's this got to do with the Bible reading? So, uh, where was I? Oh yeah, the whole like going against the way you think. So when the when it comes to like waiting till you're married before you live together, that may go against your thinking because you might think, no, it makes way more sense to move in together earlier. It makes sense. Excuse me, it makes sense. But there are things you don't there are things beyond your there are things beyond you that there are sounds so like uh, science fictiony here, but like there are forces at play that uh, that you don't see and you don't quite get, and they play into why like just because you might think you know better through experience and whatnot, and that's one of the trickiest things when it comes to belief in God. And this is across the board. It doesn't matter things of like your culture, uh, your gender, ethnicity. These things are completely irrelevant. This is true of all people. Because of our own life experiences, we tend to believe that we know better. I've done this before. I've got this. But throughout a lot of this is a common theme in all the food miracles, and this is just kind of like one of the biggest arm wrestles in the Christian life is that God will often ask to he'll ask us to do things that goes against that intuition because we're just so used to thinking we already know better. But in this story of feeding the multitude, God is telling them, just trust me. You do what I called you to do, and you can trust me to deliver. And so there's an old saying, and it's ironic because on the other hand, you know, uh, life is not a Hallmark rom-com, but the whole point of Hallmark rom-coms, how the story generally plays out, which is also why romance comedies are popular. And I mean, I'm guilty of that too. I love my Japanese romance comedies. And they all have this common theme. And the common theme is life doesn't go the way you expect it to. It often turns out better. Not always true, but usually that's the case for most people. Life may not turn out the way you want it to, but it'll often turn out better. And that's because there are factors outside of yourself at work that puts all those things into place. And so if we're too caught up in thinking, I've always done it this way, I know better. If you're caught up in that kind of thinking all the time, then you lose sight of being able to allow God to make grander. Make, this sounds a terrible way of saying it, but to have your life be part of a grander scheme. If that makes sense. And that, and you know, it's one of those things that hashtag terrible pastor mindset. But I think that's why Jesus often depicts himself as like more dubious analogs to himself. So in chapter 6, we had the whole he parallels himself with Jonah quite a bit. Among the prophets in the Old Testament, Jonah is definitely a lot more dubious. The most dubious of them all is Amos. That's a fun joke. Maybe I'll save it for another stream. But Jonah's pretty dubious. Jesus refers to himself as the thief in the night. You don't think the Son of God would equate himself with a thief of all things, but it's a big part of it. I think is because Jesus, he portrays himself as quite the schemer. if that makes sense, he's quite the schemer, and it's not just in his miracles here where he's got a scheme going on, but that's how he plays out in our own lives. And I think that's one of the things too when it comes to why Jesus asks us to do things that goes against our natural thinking, is because I'm just gonna say it this way. I know it may not be the best way of saying it. I know somebody's gonna call me out on it, but I like to think that Jesus is he's got a big scheme plot going on for your life. And half of the fun for him is the scheming. Why lie about it? I'm pretty sure Jesus wouldn't deny that half the fun for him is the scheming of how he develops our lives. And there's the rocky turns, yes, but God ultimately wants to build it for good. But he wants you to learn something along the way, which I think is the whole point of the scheming, as opposed to life being linear. And I mean that's the charm of every rom-com, is that if problem girls didn't exist, story over. If these other tensions in the main characters didn't exist, story over. But you got a long life to live. You don't want the story to be over early. And I think that's something that, as we go through life and think about why God makes these schemes, is because I think we are to enjoy the entirety of the story, every step of the way. So in the same vein, I think that's a big theme in all these food miracles, is that you go against your thinking because God is doing something bigger. He's got a scheme going on, and that scheme's gonna do great things. So with that said, let's just, well, we're not even done the chapter. I still gotta do the walk on water discourse. It's already 5 o'clock too, but that one's pretty long. That's gonna be a full discourse. See, it's one chapter, and I'm already like, oh, so much to talk about. But we get to the last part, and I already did the whole like crazier calculation thing with like I had a whole like drawing thing in my Luke reading, because the feeding of the multitude is outside of the resurrection the only miracle that is given in all four accounts of the Gospels. And for good reason. The whole thinking thing, the whole going against your thinking is a big part of that, I like to believe. Because the resurrection is obviously like the ultimate version of that. So, but when it comes to the feeding of the multitude, uh, the book of basically the book of Luke has as well, and I went into the huge calculation thing. But as you read through here, and it's consistent in all four versions, that it's pointed out that when we call it the feeding of the 5,000, and the reason why I said that was erroneous was because Scripture tells us that there were 5,000 men present. So actually, there are way more people. And the reason why there are way more people is because obviously, and not because the Bible's sexist before some smart ass says it, but the Bible didn't account for the women, and it didn't account for the children. Now, there's several reasons. The main reason behind this is because it's assumed that most of these men would have had families. Let's lowball it and say 4,000 of them had families. Highball it, you could say all 5,000 of them, but that's not realistic. You got your, really young men, so they're probably not married yet, and you have guys who can't get a girl, and you have widowers. So let's just lowball it and say there are 4,000 men that all have families. Well, we can't even say all 4,000 of them have families, because maybe just 1,000 of them are just newlyweds or something, or they don't have kids, or their kids are just not present. So let's say 1,000 of them. So before we get into the 3,000 families that I'm gonna presume here have kids, we're gonna already count that we have 3,000 people already, because we have the 1,000 guys who don't have girls, we have the 1,000 guys who do have girls but no kids, and we have those 1,000 girls we just mentioned from the 1,000 guys who's got girls. So that's already 3,000 people. Now we get to the more crazy, interesting part, and why this number is like the miracle is actually even more ridiculous than it looks. So the average family, because remember, as I mentioned before, the reason why a lot of his parables were like all farming parables is because the bulk of Jesus's audience were like farmers. So if the bulk of Jesus' audience were farmers, well, we got to play some stereotypes here. They tend to have larger families, and in the ancient world, that was for a pretty rational reason, because children were also like a resource. I know it sounds terrible to say it that way, but they're basically a resource. You need more hands on the farm. More kids means more hands on the farm. Therefore, work easier, work better, higher chance of survivability because you can till the farm better. Therefore, you want more kids. So we can assume most families are pretty big, but we are going to draw an average. A case in point, Jesus's family, he's got a whole bunch of half siblings. So when we read back in the beginning of chapter 6, there's a whole bit where like the people are like, isn't this Jesus the son of the carpenter and the son of Mary? And then they list off his 4 brothers. So there's Jesus has 4 brothers. He's got James, and we learn that he becomes one of the leaders of the church later on. So we got James, we got Joseph Jr., we got a guy named Judas, and we got a guy named Simon. So Jesus has 4 brothers. Judas is later referred to as Jude, and he is also one of the church leaders in the New Testament, in the book of Acts and later. The book of Jude is said to be written by the same Judas. So we got James, Judas, Joseph Jr., and Simon. And then there's a weird statement here that's made about how, and his sisters are here with us. So sisters means plural. So there's a minimum of 2. So if you include Jesus into that, that means Joseph and Mary had, although Jesus is like semi-adopted virgin birth thing. So that means Joseph and Mary have 7 kids. Now, I'm going to just say they're a little bit bigger than the average family. We can probably tone it down and say the average family has 4 kids. Because not every family's going to have friggin' 7 kids, okay? That's just, or more, because he could have had more sisters. The Bible doesn't tell us. I just lowballed it and said 2. But clearly, Joseph and Mary, after Jesus was born, they got busy. But we're just going to say that they're on the higher end. And we're going to lowball it and say the average family has 4, the average farmer family has 4 kids. This is to account for some of the families like Jesus' family, which would have had like maybe 7+ kids. And some families that only had like 2 kids, or even 1 kid. So we're just going to average it out and say 4 kids. So if we have 3,000 families where we have an average of 4 kids per family, well, that means we have 3,000 men. We got 3,000 women with them to make those 4 kids per family. So if we were to put that in a calculator, I'm going to open a calculator. I'm not going to put it on screen, though. Maybe I should put it on screen. Where's my calculator? Where's my display capture? No. Video capture off. So we got a calculator here. So we first said we had the 1,000 dudes that got no girl. Then we have to add the next 1,000 dudes that got a girl but no kids. Then we add the next one. We add those 1,000 girls. Whoops. We add those 1,000 girls with the guys that got no kids. Then we add the 3,000 other guys that I mentioned that were still there, because the Bible said there were 5,000 men. So now we have the 5,000 men accounted for. So those 3,000... Wait, what? I gotta do it all over again. So first we got the 1,000 guys that got no girl. We got 1,000 guys that got a girl but no kids. Those 1,000 girls we just mentioned, we gotta add them in the calculation. And I just did it again. Oh, crap. There. Then we add the 3,000 guys to account for the fact that the Bible said there were 5,000 guys. So we got 3,000 more guys to account for. And all 3,000 of those guys got girls. So that's another 3,000. Then we're going to do a plus 3,000 families times 4. Oh, crap. No. Wait, that's right. Huh? Uh-oh. I think it screwed up. The calculator did not do the GED-math properly. I gotta do it all over again. Come on, wait. Okay, so let's start with the kids first. So we got 3,000 we got 3,000 families times 4 kids per family. That's already 12,000. The kids alone double the number of people that the Bible said. Like, if people said that Jesus only fed 5,000 people, they're just wronger than wrong. Because we already have, the kids alone is already twice that number. Plus 3,000 dudes with families. The ladies. The 1,000 dudes that don't got no girl. We got the 1,000 dudes that do got a girl, but no kids. And we got to add those girls. I did it. There you go. So, the minimum, and remember, this is me lowballing it. The minimum is that there are 21,000 people present. Which means, one, that's way more food that Jesus had to make. Because remember, I made that whole thing about the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish is like 1 family. So you could probably divide this by 4 and say that's how many fish were there. Or sorry. No, if you divide the number by 5. No. You don't need to divide by 5 because we'll just say the bread is 1-to-1. So it's basically times, so it would be divided by oh, see, no, I shouldn't have hit the divide button. Should hit the multiply button. I want to do 2/5. So 2 divided by 5. So there were 8. Jesus magically created 8,400 fish for them to eat. Actually, he probably made more than that because the Bible also mentions that there were 12 baskets at the end. But maybe that's because some of the kids didn't eat as much. So that's also possible. We just say that Jesus made this many fish. We'll leave the bread at 21,000 because we're just going to assume one person, one loaf of bread. That's a lot of fish, though. Like, just out of the ether. And remember, they started with 2 fish. They started with 2 fish to come up with this number. And remember, this is me lowballing it. We could even hit it's over 9,000 fish. So, yeah, that's how many fish there were. Not only is this an absurd amount of food, but that also would have taken a lot of space for them to, sit people in groups of hundreds and fifties. That would have needed a lot of space. But yeah, the miracle is even more ridiculous than what you just see at first. Because a lot of people erroneously say that Jesus only fed 5,000 people when the Bible actually says that the men present was 5,000. And so that calculation I just did was the low ball end of how many people could have actually been there. And on the high end, if you wanted to be ridiculous, you would say that every guy was married, which means you already have 10,000 people with just parents. And then you highballed higher the amount of kids and said every family had 5 kids. So that would be like 35,000 people, which is almost twice the number we just calculated. So, and that would be like, well, if you take that number, you would have like 30,000 fish or something ridiculous like that. Okay, not quite. No, sorry. Why did I say 30,000? You would have like 15,000 fish or something like that. For just over 30,000, like 35,000 people, be like 15,000 fish. It's a ridiculous number. That's what I'm getting at. The numbers get absurd when you start like nitpicking at these details. Which then just makes Jesus even more impressive than he already is. Because if he was to feed 5,000 people with 5 bread and 2 fish, that would have been pretty amazing enough. Considering that already is impossible. But when you like consider the text saying that there was only men, and then you start making calculations like this, the numbers just get more ridiculous. So I think that's another good reason why this miracle is like the most well-known miracle outside of the resurrection, because of how massive it is. Because sure, you could talk about like all the healing individual people Jesus does, but if you wanted like wow, this is the most epic thing Jesus does outside of the resurrection, it's feeding this many people. that would be it. All right, finally, let's talk about the Jesus walks on water story. So, there's several versions of this one. The Book of Matthew has the other like well-known version. The Book of Matthew has like an added bit to the story, but the Book of Mark version is very simple. So the story basically, Jesus sends the disciples across the lake. He's like, all right, you guys are gonna go to Bethsaida next. I'm gonna stay here for a little bit, pray to the Father and all that. I'm gonna chill out here for a bit. You guys go by boat. And it's assumed to be nighttime, which just shows how like hardcore people are in the Bible, where it's like, oh yeah, we just spent all day doing teaching to like over 20,000 people. And now we're gonna go sail all night to go to a place and start preaching there the next day. Like, that's mega hardcore. But anyway, so Jesus is like, all right, I'm gonna stay here. You guys go on boat. And I'll see you guys there. And the disciples like, okay. I mean, I guess we should do what he says, because we just saw him do crazy things when, we listened to him last time, so we'll just do what he says. And so the disciples start heading over, and then the text itself is pretty interesting about this. So I'm just going to point out some little bits that always stood out to me about this particular version of the story. So the first one is the way the Bible says it, that Jesus saw the disciples straining. I'm reading verse 48. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And the way that the Bible says it is like Jesus sees them. So I'm like, Jesus got, Jesus using his clairvoyant powers. He can see stuff that's like far away, because the assumption is that when Jesus stayed on land, he's not he's not in the water. And it'd be hard if you're on land and a bunch of guys have been sailing for a couple hours, you wouldn't see them. So how would Jesus know that this was happening? I mean, you could make the argument that he just looked at the skies like, oh, it's stormy. I guess they're struggling out there, like you do. I mean, that's one way of explaining that. But the way the Bible says it, it's just like implies that Jesus is using his clairvoyance powers, and he's like, oh yes, I can see they're struggling over there. Better go check up on them. And then it gets even more funny with that being said. So, continuing on. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. So, think of it from a timeline sense. So, Jesus tells, they just finished feeding all those people, the 20,000 plus people. And then it probably got like dark by then because they had to clean up everything after, the whole collecting it in 12 baskets thing. They had to clean up everything. And then Jesus says, all right, go and start sailing to Bethsaida, which means it's nighttime at this point because it was getting dark earlier. So it's dark now. And so Jesus like, yeah, go head over. And so the Bible says that they've just been struggling for a while. But as you see here, the Bible then says it's almost dawn when Jesus starts walking out toward them. Like, it's still dark, but it's like the later part of night. So, I don't know, Middle East doesn't change their day-night cycle all that much because, close to the equator and all that. But let's just assume it's like 4 in the morning or 4 in the morning. Because, well, sunlight might come around 6. So let's say like 4:30 to 5 in the morning. So Jesus starts walking out, which means that, remember, these guys have been up all night trying to survive this storm, which you would probably beg the question, why the hell would these people go out in the storm in the middle of the night? Or sorry, go sailing on a boat in the middle of the night, only to have the worst possible luck, to have a storm in the middle of the night, which is the worst time because you can't see the damn thing. Yeah, that's why like storms at night are so dangerous, because, it's dark. You already can't see as it is. You don't know if there's like crap flying around in the middle of the night that could hit you. Which is also why, like, that's the major reason why, stay indoors when, like, there's a storm out. Especially at night. Because you don't know if stuff could just fly right at you in the pitch of black. That would be a terrible way to go. But anyway, so the Bible implies that these guys have been struggling with the storm all night. And then Jesus is like, yeah, I'm just going to casually go out there and go check how they're doing. And then there's an interesting little bit of text here. It's at the very end of verse 48. And it says that Jesus was about to pass them. So the funniest thing about this is that Jesus wasn't even going to help them. He was just like, I'll see how those guys are doing. It looks like that, like, if the Bible mentions that he was going to pass them, he probably looked at them and thought, they're fine. This is not a big problem. There's just a little bit of gust here. It's fine. I'll just keep walking on my way, and I'll see them at Bethsaida, like I said I would. I always thought that was hilarious. I'm like, wow, did Jesus really just pull like a, oh, you guys seem fine. See you guys later. They didn't tithe. They're good. I think your English is broken there. I don't know what you mean by that. What do you mean they're good after they didn't tithe? That's not how that works. But anyway, so Jesus is like, they're fine. I'll just keep going. So it's funny that like the Bible mentions that he wasn't even planning to help them. Which makes you think like, well, that's kind of mean. I mean, it's a storm. You should just help somebody. But I mean, there's also like the whole shame honor thing, which we're not going to spend another hour talking about that. But there's the whole shame honor thing where it's like you uh, don't do for a person what they can do themselves. Which actually, with that being said, and this is a case in point of like like even as modern people, we still heavily um, perform shame and honor culture. Yeah, we're gonna do a short discourse on this, but like I remember when I was a security guard, and one of the things about security work is that you're technically customer service. And so we're talking like customer service jobs, and one of the key ideas of customer service is never do for a customer what they can do themselves. And this is especially true when you're like dealing with people who have like special needs. So, if you see a person with like a stretcher, or not stretcher, sorry. Why did I say a stretcher? Uh, the what's the stick thing called that you walk with? It's not a stretcher. The stretcher is the bed thing. What is the long cane like thing that they use? Why is it slipping my mind? Well, anyway, if you see a person with that, you don't like immediately walk up and see if they need help. A crutch? Yeah, a crutch. If you see a person walking with a crutch, you don't immediately walk up to them and like try to help them. Because that's like the psyche behind that is, you know, they already know their life is in the crapper. They don't need you to make it worse by making them feel shitty about it. So you don't help people if they can do something on their own. That's kind of a fundamental thing you learn about customer service. Don't help somebody in something that they can do themselves. And so maybe Jesus was thinking that when he was walking by the disciples. He's like, these guys are experienced fishermen. They know how to deal with like boats and storms. They'll be fine. They don't need me. So Jesus was just gonna pass by them, which I always found it to be kind of funny. And that's how I always interpreted that passage. Which brings back the whole like very human part of Jesus's character where he's just like, eh, I'm sure things will turn out fine. And having like a very chillax attitude. Despite the fact that, you know, he's God and has to deal with the problem of sin in the world. But he has moments like these where he's just like the most chill person on the planet. I always find those moments so funny. But then of course, ironically, it is this very thing that causes the panic. So the disciples see Jesus walking on water, you know, doing stuff people don't do. And they freak out and they think he's a ghost. Now, there's several reasons for this. The first is, well, if you see anything walking around at night and you're not able to easily decipher what it is, you're gonna think it's some kind of like dangerous thing. And then you've got to add another factor on top of that. That the whole Jewish mythology mindset thing, you know, people that can do miracles and have magic powers, afterlife stuff, resurrection, all that. So when they thought it, and it's interesting they use a word choice of like ghost. So now I'm immediately gonna take what some people may think is a contradiction, but it's once again, it's like just because Jewish mythology thought a certain way doesn't mean everybody thought this way. Because I mean, not everybody's of the same social class. You think everybody's going to be the same religio thinking class? Obviously not. So when they thought he was a ghost, the disciples probably thought, and this is common thinking in most mythologies and religions, this is why like you hear like when you hear ghost stories and stuff like that, the reason why it's a big deal when you see a ghost is because this is the psychology behind it. The ancient belief of if you saw a ghost or supernatural beings, the belief was, oh, I can see into the spirit world. And if I can see into the spirit world, it means I'm probably 1 foot in to the afterlife and my other foot is not far behind. And so if people, and that's why, like, you know, seeing a ghost was a big deal. If you see a ghost, you're basically like, oh shit, I'm as good as dead now. That's basically what it means. And so when the disciples saw Jesus and thought he was a ghost, they were probably thinking, well, we're dead. We're dead. Storm's gonna finish us off. We've been fighting this thing for like hours on end through the night. This is where it's gonna claim us. We're gonna die out here in the middle of the water and just have a crappy end to it all. That's probably what the disciples were thinking, which is why they would probably freak out when they saw Jesus walking on water and thinking he was a ghost. But it's funny because Jesus then says, "Hey guys, like, take courage. It is I. It's me. Don't be afraid." And so Jesus is trying to dispel that thinking. Because that's probably what the disciples were all thinking. They're all thinking the whole, well, we're all dead. We're all going to die here. But Jesus is dispelling that, and that's why he has to be so firm with his words and be like, don't be afraid. Take courage. It's me. So on the one hand, it's like, okay, miracle is happening. Jesus walks on water. But the way that Jesus goes about it is very nonchalant and very, like, tries to demystify a lot of things, because he's dispelling the superstitious we're gonna die moment, as well as he acts in a way that's just like simple words to give comfort. And I also think about how, going back to Mark chapter 2, where this is where Jesus, like, the human side of Jesus being very practical with his words. So you think back in chapter 2 and the story about the paralyzed person, and Jesus says to him, your sins are forgiven. And when the people question him thinking he's blaspheming, Jesus says, well, what's easier to say to somebody? That you are forgiven, or get up and walk, even though I can clearly see you can't do that. And so in the same way, when Jesus tells the disciples, hey guys, like, relax, don't be afraid, he's being very practical about it. He's just saying everything's gonna be okay, and not making a big spectacle about it. He's not making like some lofty, like, the storm will immediately quiet down because I'm here. Like, he's not doing anything lofty like that. He's just giving them practical words that the disciples would immediately grasp and be like, hey guys, it's gonna be okay. And that's what it comes down to when it comes to our Christian lives. You know, because we just read several discourses where one of the biggest struggles of accepting Jesus in our modern culture, for sure, but it's been a thing since, I don't know, since Christianity was a thing, is that oftentimes Jesus will ask us to do things that goes against our thinking. And it's so easy to be like, oh, it's too hard, it's too scary. There's just too many uncertainties. There's too many risk factors. There's too many things like I don't know if I could do it. But one of the things we just need to be reminded about at all times, and Jesus gives his reassurance to the disciples, and it's also true in our own lives, that Jesus tells us it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. And I think that's something that, you know, in the world today, a lot of people can feel like, oh man, like the world's gone to crap and whatever. You hear so much of that doomerism crap out there. The other day I had to like constantly harp on somebody, because one of the things I can't stand is like the black pilling that's going on. Like, I was talking to a guy, younger, way better looking than me, and in pretty good shape, and he was talking about like, oh man, I'm never gonna meet a girl. It's like, holy crap, what is happening to people that they're self-destructing like this? Right? Like, what's all this doomerism shit? But I think when we lose sight of God, and okay, now I'm gonna go into this discourse, but like, part of why there's so much doomerism in North American culture is because as we've abandoned God as a culture, we no longer have that comfort that He gives to us. And oftentimes, and I know a lot of people don't like, I know a lot of people, especially Christians, don't like hearing it this way. But more often than not, the truth of the matter is the first thing Jesus will say when we pray, before some theologian goes, well, the whole like God answers prayer with a yes or a no thing. You know what the first thing Jesus will say when we pray to Him? Before He gives an answer of yes or no to our prayers? The first thing Jesus is going to say is, it's going to be okay. Don't be afraid. It's me. In my experience, in my prayer life, that's usually the first thing Jesus says. It's going to be okay. Whether your prayer request gets answered or not is a whole different issue. But the first thing that Jesus says is going to be okay. Just like how He responds to the disciples in their dire hour of the night. Jesus comes out of them and says, hey guys, take courage. It's going to be okay. And that's something I want to encourage all of you with as well, is that, it, even with all the struggles you have in life, we all have them. As we trust Jesus in our life, the first thing to remember is that things are going to be okay. Hey, Quincy Overton. You're Quincy now. Welcome to the stream. Which is funny, I say that because we're going to end pretty soon. But before I do end the stream, we're just going to do a bit of housekeeping. And then we're going to end it. Because it is 5:30. I gotta go real soon, so... And we have been on for over 2 hours, so I think it's one chapter. I really hope that not every single stream is going to just be one chapter. I really don't want this series to be like 20 parts. But, I mean, it might have to at this rate. Which is fine, I guess. Maybe we will start doing it that way from now on. We'll see. Chapter 7 is not that long. So we'll see. But the thing I'm worried about is that, like, we might still... I mean, at the same time, it would be fine if, like... And maybe I should encourage you guys to do this more as well. You guys ever, like, want to prepare questions beforehand as well to next Friday's reading stream, then by all means. And I don't mind that eating Bible reading time. I think that's fine too. Hi, Linny. Welcome to the stream, even though we're going to be closing pretty soon. So the housekeeping for streams. So next week we have the standard Unicorn Overlord. They're good streams. Easy series to get a dozen shows from. True. So anyway, Monday, 2 o'clock Pacific time, we'll be resuming Unicorn Overlord. And then it's going to be it should be a standard week next week. We have Unicorn Overlord Monday and Thursday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. And then next Friday, we will be reading chapter 7 of the book of Mark. And hopefully by next weekend, I should have the next D4DJ video. Maybe. I've just started collecting the stuff I'm going to use for the next video. It's the question of putting it together and getting it to my editor in time. Yeah, so that's maybe D4DJ next week. Next weekend. It would be later in the week if I was to do a D4DJ video. So, to just give a quick overview of that again. Unicorn Overlord, Monday, Thursday. And then Friday, reading stream at 3 o'clock Pacific time, just like... Well, today I was a little bit late, but like today. And then maybe D4DJ next weekend. So that's the general agenda for next week. seems that there are no questions, so we're gonna, and that's fine because I do need to get going soon anyway. It's like 5:30. So, with that said, this is gonna be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed reading through Mark chapter 6 with me. Until Monday, which is when we'll be live next. I hope you guys have a great Friday night. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys then. God bless you, and good night.